Sovereign Xylia's eyes snapped open, glowing not with her natural Valerian red, but with a cold, piercing human silver. The high-pitched whine of the prime casing reached a bone-shaking frequency as the armor's joints locked, pinning the most powerful warrior in the sector against the command console. "Kalen?" she gasped, the silver light bleeding into the veins of her neck. "What have you done? How did a human prisoner end up holding the life of a sovereign in his hands?" If you want to see how deep this cosmic mystery goes, subscribe to follow the journey. Now, let's go back to where the silence began. A standard month ago, the air in the maintenance ducts had been thick with the smell of scorched grease and despair. Kalen Voss spent his days scrubbing the carbon scoring off atmospheric scrubbers, his world reduced to the width of his shoulders and the rhythmic clinking of a rusted multi-wrench clipped to his belt. The Aegis of Valor was a vessel of jagged obsidian and impossible geometry, yet it felt like a tomb. Above, in the gilded halls of the bridge, a storm was breaking. Sovereign Xylia stood over a pedestal where the crown of Valor, a legendary family heirloom, lay in two jagged pieces. It wasn't just metal. It was the heart of their lineage, and it had simply ceased to function. Artificer KRRTK, the Empire's greatest mind, could only hiss in frustration as his scanning beams passed through the alloy without registering a single atom. To the Valerians, it was a quantum ghost. To them, the tech was divine and God was dead. Kalen heard the Sovereign's rage echoing through the ventilation grates. Her voice was a low vibration that made the dust dance on his coveralls. He shouldn't have been listening, and he certainly shouldn't have crawled closer, but the way she described the failure, the unresponsive singing of the metal, sounded familiar. He risked a glance through the slats. The armor was beautiful, but as he squinted at the microfractures, he saw it. Beneath the Valerian etchings were tiny, precise geometric symbols. They weren't alien. They were a derivation of ancient Terran circuit mapping, a language humans hadn't spoken since the Great Collapse, but one Kalen had spent his childhood studying in the ruins of old Earth. And then he did the unthinkable. He pushed the grate open. The Valerian guards had their spears at his throat before his boots hit the floor. KRRTK looked at the primitive human with a sneer, but Xylia gestured for silence. Kalen didn't look at the guards. He looked at the armor, his hand reaching for the rusted wrench at his side. "The metal isn't dead," Kalen said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his knees. "It's just grieving. You're trying to talk to it in a language it was never meant to hear." Xylia stepped forward, her red eyes burning. "You are a scavenger, a creature of dirt and recycled air. You claim to understand the prime casing." "I don't claim to understand your magic," Kalen replied, holding up his battered wrench. "But I know how we used to think. This isn't a crown. It's an interface. Is it possible that the greatest secrets of the galaxy are buried in our own forgotten history? Join us as we uncover the truth of the Archfounders." Kalen was led to the engineering bay under heavy guard. The Valerians watched with a mix of curiosity and disgust as he laid out his crude tools next to their elegant light shapers. He touched the prime casing, and for the first time the metal didn't feel cold. It felt expectant. He realized then that the Valerians hadn't built this. They had inherited it, treating a piece of high-end human engineering as a religious relic. They had forgotten that even a god needs a proper ground wire. The engineering bay hummed with a low, rhythmic throb that Kalen felt in his molars. For 3 days, he had ignored the suspicious glares of the Valerian elite, focusing instead on the crown and the prime casing. He worked with his rusted multi-wrench, an object the Valerians treated as a piece of garbage, yet it was the only tool small enough to manipulate the recessed analog overrides hidden behind the armor's ceremonial plating. KRRTK watched as Kalen bypassed a glowing crystal array. "You bypass the spirit node? You will blind the armor." "It's not a spirit node," Kalen muttered, wiping sweat from his brow with a greasy sleeve. "It's a high-frequency sensor that's been misaligned for centuries. It's trying to see through a wall of its own feedback." He wasn't just fixing a machine, he was translating a legacy. The Valerians had built an empire on divine tech, never realizing their gods were just humans who knew how to bridge the gap between thought and matter. He found the audio logs then. Distorted, staticky voices speaking in a dialect of English that made his heart ache with a strange, inherited grief. They weren't prayers. They were maintenance logs. The peace didn't last. The ship shuddered violently as the Obsidian Collective's fleet dropped from warp, their heavy disruptors slamming into the Aegis. The armor! Xylia shouted over the klaxons. I must lead the counter-assault. It's not ready, Kalen yelled back, but the Sovereign was already stepping into the frame. The prime casing snapped shut, the ancient human tech sensing the biological urgency of its wearer. Kalen scrambled to the diagnostic terminal, his fingers flying over the holographic interface that now showed the true human subroutines. And now we return to that moment on the bridge, where the air smells of ozone and the weight of two civilizations hangs in the balance. And now, in the heart of the chaos, Xylia's eyes weren't her own. The silver light of the Archfounders flooded her vision, and Kalen watched the power levels on his terminal spike into the red. He didn't hesitate. He jammed his rusted wrench into the primary conduit, manually forcing the power distribution away from the weapon systems and into the tactical processors. The armor didn't just fire. It predicted. Xylia moved with a fluidity no Valerian had ever achieved, her strikes landing exactly where the enemy shields were weakest, guided by the ghosts of human engineers. The Obsidian fleet, caught in a trap they couldn't see, broke and fled. When the glow finally faded, Xylia stood amidst the cooling vents of the bridge, her breathing heavy. She looked at Kalen, then at the armor, seeing it for what it truly was for the first time. She reached up and unlatched the helmet. It was never magic, she whispered, her voice stripped of its sovereign silk. No, Kalen said, leaning against the console, his hands shaking. It was just us, trying to survive. She looked at the rusted wrench still lodged in the conduit, the primitive tool that had saved an empire. With a slow, deliberate motion, she pulled it free and handed it back to him. You are no longer a captive, Kalen Voss, and your people are no longer ghosts. The Aegis of Valor didn't return to the Valerian capital. Instead, it carved a path toward a small, blue-green marble on the edge of the sector. As they entered orbit around Earth, the Sovereign placed the rusted wrench on the central pedestal where the crown had once sat. It was no longer a symbol of a prisoner's status, but a monument to the bridge built between two worlds. The silver light of the stars reflected off the old metal, silent and finally at peace. How would you feel if you discovered your greatest legends were just the forgotten echoes of your own ancestors? If you want to explore more hidden histories, come back tomorrow as